Today we're working on this 2008 Dodge Cummins 6.7 liter turbo diesel. We're going to be replacing the high pressure fuel pump. So before we get started, we'll go ahead and disconnect the batteries, and then we'll zoom in and show you a better picture of what we're going to be working on and where we're going to be working area-wise. Looking in from the driver's side of the vehicle, just behind the radiator fan shroud, you can see the high pressure fuel pump sits just below the top radiator hose. So it's actually fairly accessible on this engine. Luckily for us, we have very little work to get around to get to the high pressure fuel pump. Now in our case, we're actually going to be showing you the removal and installation on a stand engine. So it's going to be a little bit better clarity for you in that regard. But this is to show you on your vehicle, really the only things you're going to have to remove to get great access to this pump are going to be the serpentine belt, the upper radiator hose, and in some cases, if you'd like a little bit more room to remove the pump once it's actually unbolted from the housing, you can go ahead and remove your throttle body housing here, and that's going to give you a direct opening to pull that pump out. And fortunately on this pump, we don't have very many connections. We have a few hoses and 3 bolts holding the pump to the back of the housing and 1 main bolt holding the spindle on from the front of the housing. Outside of that, we have 1 electrical connection, and it's actually a pretty quick removal and installation once you have the area cleared out and access to it. We're going to show you that on the engine stand here in just a moment. Before we get started with the installation, I do want to point out there are 2 different pumps that look very similar for the Cummins engine, and they are both what are called CP3 pumps. However, there is a big difference in the 2, as the pump on my left fits the 6.7 liter Cummins engine, while the pump on my right is going to fit the 5.9 liter Cummins engine, the later model 5.9 from 03 to 07. Now, the reason I show you this is because on the 5.9 liter, the later model, and the 6.7 liter, the removal and installation are almost identical. So this video can be used and served as the purpose for doing both the installation and removal of the 6.7 liter pump or the 5.9 liter pump, depending on which one you're working on. But I do want to point out there are some differences, and most of the differences are going to be on the actual fuel connections themselves. Now, if we look at the 6.7 liter pump on the left-hand side, we're going to have a quick disconnect line here. We're going to have our pump to the rail line in the back, and we're going to have our fuel return line right here in about the middle. Now similarly on the 5.9 liter pump, we're going to still have our fuel line from the pump to the rail in the back. Then we're going to have our fuel pressure limiting valve line in the middle, and we're going to have our fuel return back to the filter on the top here. Aside from those connections on the fuel lines and the torque specifications that are going to coincide with what you need to tighten them down to during the installation, there are no other differences. The bolts are going to secure the pump in the same way. You're going to secure the pump the same way on the front of the housing with the nut that goes on the shaft itself. And for the fuel control actuator, if we lift these up and take a look at both of them, on the 6.7, the actuator has the connection on the left side towards the inside of the pump. And if we look at the 5.9 liter, it's the same setting. The only difference is that the connection is on the outside of the pump. So again, they're very similar. They look almost identical. And if you were just to look at these from a distance or just at a quick glance, you're not going to think you have 2 different pumps until you look at those different connections. And we will list those torque specifications for you so you'll know the difference between the 6.7 liter torque specifications on the lines versus the 5.9 liter torque specifications on the lines. As I said in the beginning, we actually have an engine that's been taken out of service at this point and on a stand, but that gives us a great opportunity to get a little bit further back and show you on the engine itself the easiest way to get around all of these components. Now, here is where we would have been talking about having that radiator hose and the fan belt right here. So again, once those items are removed, you'll have access to that front cover here that you're going to need to remove here in just a moment. So this is why we're going to have it on the stand. Gives you a better idea of what you're working with, and we can show you in a little bit better clarity how to remove everything and what needs to be removed before you can actually install the new pump. Now, one thing I will note, and we talked about this before, there are two different pumps depending on which model of the engine you're working on. The one we're working on here and the one we referenced in the beginning is the 6.7 liter. Now there is the 2003 to 2007 5.9 liter model. And again, as I stated before, they're both CP3 pumps. The biggest difference being we have a line on this pump that's going to, instead of being here, it's going to be on the top for the 5.9 liter. So we still have our fuel line up to the fuel rail in the back. We still have our banjo bolt here. Instead though, we're going to have a line coming to the top of the CP3 pump on the 5.9 liter versus this version on the 6.7 liter. And then also, as I referenced in the beginning, our connection here is going to be reversed. Our actual connection will be on the back side versus the front side. Other than that, just a few other small changes, and it's really the exact same removal and installation process for the 5.9 liter and the 6.7 liter. So at this point, we should already have the batteries removed or disconnected. We should have the serpentine belt disconnected and out of the way, and the upper radiator hose out of the way. And the first thing we want to do is go ahead and remove this front cover. Now, the way to do that, it's very simple. Just take a 3/8 drive. In this case, if you have it in the vehicle, the preference would be on a longer extension. That way you can access it a little bit easier and not have to lean over the fender itself. We'll just pop that in and then turn that cover, and then we can remove it. Fairly simple on that part of the removal process. And by removing that cover, it's going to allow us access to the front nut that's holding onto the spindle of the pump and into the housing itself. Now, I'll zoom in on this when I go to remove it, but one thing you want to be very careful about, there is a spacer or washer that's behind this nut that you need to make sure you secure either with your finger, or in a lot of cases the easier way to do it would use a extendable magnet or a magnet extension, and hold on to that as you're removing that nut. There's a small gap inside of this housing that if it were to fall into, it could be very difficult to get it back out, and that's just going to be a lot more work on your end. So we'll show you how that process is done, and then we'll come to the back side of the pump itself. But we'll go ahead and start by removing the front nut on the spindle. With our cover removed, we can now loosen our nut and pull that out. But again, remember, we want to make sure we keep our finger back here to not allow that spacer, that washer, to fall down. Now I'm using a 1-inch socket. I have the room for the longer extension socket here. You may need to get a shorter socket for this to work. Again, I'm using a 1-inch. You can also use a 27 millimeter. Either will work for this nut. So now that I have the nut free, I'm going to use my hand to back it off slowly and just put my finger back here to make sure that that spacer washer is still intact on the spindle. Again, we don't want that to fall down. You could use a extendable magnet to hold it back there, but once you feel it, you can tell that it's not coming off the spindle. You'll still need this magnet in a moment though. So once the nut is free, immediately go in with your magnet, grab that spacer, and hold that to the side along with your nut. Now you can have that confidence that both came along. You don't have anything falling down into the housing, and you can move on to the next step. For the next steps in the process, we're going to need a 19 millimeter wrench, as well as a 3/8 ratchet and 17 millimeter socket to remove some of the lines on this pump that we're removing. Now we've already disconnected our pigtail here, and for our connection here, we just have a quick disconnect. You want to be very careful with these because they do break very easily. So what I would recommend is get this line out of the way first. Give yourself a little bit more room to work here. This is where our 17 millimeter is going to come into play. And it's just going to release that banjo bolt from its location. And once we have that removed, we can set that out of the way. And now that we have that line free, we can go to the line that's going to be going from the pump itself up to the fuel rail. Now these are both going to be a 19mm fitting. That's where our wrench is going to come into play. So we'll use our wrench to break free here, and then at the top of this line, which is only about 10 inches away from the pump itself, we'll just break that nut free at the top so that we can easily move the line out of the way. We don't want that line to be stiff, because if we have a stiff line like that and we go to move the pump out, we could have damage to the line. We could crimp it, break it. We don't want to have that happen and cause more work for ourselves. So we'll loosen up the side of the pump, then we'll loosen up at the top where the fuel rail is, and then we can just move this line out of the way. And with both connections loosened, we can now take our line and just set it out of the way there and to the bottom. And now all that remains on the pump itself, aside from the bolts holding it on, is our quick disconnect. So we'll grab our 2 tabs here, we'll pop that off, and then we're going to have 3 bolts in the back that will have to be removed, and we'll get to that in just a moment. So moving on to our next step, we're going to need to have a pulley pulling tool. A lot of these you can actually rent from your local parts store, or if you have your own. The most important thing is we want to get it locked in to the front where that spindle nut was. There's actually going to be 2 threaded spots for these bolts to lock this tool on and break this pump free from the housing. Don't have to put a lot of force on this. A few turns will actually get it broken free, and you want to leave this in place when you come back to the back side of the pump. So on the pump, behind our fuel connection line here, we have 1 nut on this side, we have 1 on this side as well, and then we have 1 at the bottom. Now all of those are going to be 13mm, and the only one you're going to need a extension for will be in the back. Now I can get it with a 3-inch extension in this particular setting where I have the engine on the stand. You may need a 6-inch extension to get there if you're going over the side of the fender. So again, get yourself broken free here at the front of the pump. Again, don't use a whole lot of force on this. You just want to break it free and then leave this in place while you pull these 3 nuts off. And then once these are free, the pump will have a little bit of play, but that's when we'll come back and we'll slowly turn on this threaded bar here, and this pulley remover or pulley removal tool will actually push the pump out of the slot at a much better pace than what some people would use a rubber mallet and another tool for. We don't want to bang on this thing. We just want to ease it out the way it was meant to be. There are some specialty tools just for this particular engine and this particular pump. Again, you can get those. If you have one of those, that's great. If not, any tool like this will work. You just want to be easy on the housing itself and the pump when you're pushing that out. So we have ourselves broken free. Now we're going to go in, we're going to get these bolts and nuts out of the back, the one in the front, and then the one on the bottom. And once those are broken free, we can just get in there with our hands and back those all the way out. And as you can see, I now have the 3 bolts removed that are holding the bolts on that keep the pump secured from the back side. And the pump is still firmly in place. That's because we haven't done any working on the actual removal tool itself yet. So we'll put those bolts away and out of the side. And then using that same 13mm socket on this particular tool, it may be different on the one that you're using, we're going to slowly work that pump out. It's important too to keep a hand on the pump. We want this to come out straight. So we're going to slowly push against the front of the spindle. And as you can see, the pump will slowly move out of that housing, and we're not doing any forcing whatsoever. And so now that we've used the tool to push on the front of the spindle, we've got the pump itself free. And if we were working on your engine, this is where removing the throttle body may have been helpful for you, because it's going to give you a little bit more access to take the pump and pull it straight out. And just like that, we have the old unit removed, and we can now go on to the installation of the new unit. Now that we have the pump removed, it's time to put the new pump back in. And I talked in the earlier part of this video about the differences between the 5.9 liter pump and the 6.7 liter pump, where there were different connections for the fuel, different torque specifications. But aside from that, there not being very many differences at all. The only major difference, though, between the 6.7 liter pump and 5.9 liter pump, outside of those that I discussed earlier, is going to be the end of the shaft and the phase procedure required on the 6.7 liter pump. Now on this pump, when you look at the end of the shaft, you're going to see a 3-digit number starting with 7 and 5. I know it's hard to see on the camera here, but right here at my thumb, there is a 3-digit number. This one just happens to be 754. The pump phase procedure is simply rotating the shaft until the 5, which is right here, is in the 9 o'clock position, which is where I have it now. It's in the 9 o'clock position at the pump. So when I go to put the pump in, it'll go in straight, just like this, with that shaft and the 5 at the 9 o'clock position. It's very important to make sure that whenever you are aligning the pump onto the studs that hold it onto the bracket, that stay in the 9 o'clock position. Luckily, once you get it through the housing, you'll still be able to see that number, and you can make sure it's still on the 5 prior to putting that nut back around the shaft itself. So that's one final key difference between the 5.9 liter and 6.7 liter that's important to make sure of. So with our shaft at the 9 o'clock position with the number 5 here, we'll go ahead and line the pump up to the 3 studs that are holding it up. It's very important to be careful here not to damage the surface of the mating surface of either side. So we want to take our time and gently line that up. Now, just by hand, that's as far as I can force it on. And the reason I show you that is for 2 reasons. One, prior to letting the pump go all the way in, we need to take some clean engine oil, very little bit, and just go around our O-ring, then slide it in, and we're going to stop once we get to where we feel resistance. Here's why we're going to do that. We now have the shaft where it needs to be. We have the pump on all 3 studs, and we have just enough of the stud on the backside coming through the pump to where we can get 1 or 2 threads of each of the nuts on the studs. Now, just like earlier when we removed the old pump, we used the puller to push the pump out. We're now going to use those bolts on the back side of the studs to slowly, 1 or 2 turns at a time on each nut, drive the pump back into the housing without forcing it or beating on it with any type of hammer or rubber mallet or anything like that. So that's going to be our next step. We've got it where we feel resistance. We've got a little bit of clean engine oil on that seal. And now we're going to take the nuts and we're going to slowly work that pump back in. So as you can see, I have the bolts in the back now. We still have our gap, but now that we've got them on a couple of threads each, we can start slowly turning this pump in. Just a few times on each side so that we get it nice and even. We don't do any cross threading. That's the nice thing about this pump only having 3 bolts on the backhand side. They're all fairly accessible, and you can evenly distribute the amount of force pushing that pump back on to the housing. And just like that, we can tighten up each bolt, and we now have our pump realigned back in the housing. And we can go ahead and torque these down and make sure they're tight and secure. The last thing we want to do before we go anywhere near putting the nut on the shaft is make sure that that 5 is still in the 9 o'clock position, which it should be, because we didn't do any forcing or beating on this to get it into the housing. We aligned it, we got it in there at a slow, nice pace to where we caused no damage, and we made sure it was lined up properly. So that 5 should be right where it's supposed to be. However, if in your case you do find that the 5 is moved, just rotate that shaft again and make sure that that 5 is in the 9 o'clock position. And now that we verified that our 5 is in fact still in the 9 o'clock position, we're going to make sure that we take very good care to get the spacer washer back on the shaft and in place, and it doesn't fall down. We'll take our nut, we'll go ahead and thread that on. And then just like with everything else, we're going to have to torque this down to a specific specification that Cummins has come up with. So we'll get this torqued down, and then we can put our cover back on, and even that's going to have a specific torque setting that's going to have to be used to get that cover back on. So we'll torque down our bolt here, get our cover back on, and then we'll go back to our lines. And now with our shaft nut on, torque down to the right specification, our cover on and torque down to the right specification, and our 3 bolts in the back tighten down and torque to the right specification, we can go ahead and start putting our lines back on, and we'll start basically in the reverse of what we did in the beginning. We'll go ahead and get our quick disconnect line, easiest of the procedure so far. Pop that back on. We'll get our banjo bolt, and we'll go ahead and get that in a couple of threads. And then we'll take our line for our fuel to the rail. And for now, what we're going to do is we're just going to make sure that it's in place. We're going to go ahead and thread that on just a little bit, because remember, we followed that line to the top of the rail and we loosened it up there as well. So we're going to have to make sure that we go back and tighten the top nut as well as the bottom nut here before we start this engine back up. And that will actually take care of the rest of the installation procedure. Now again, you want to make sure that you torque down all your lines to the correct specifications and make sure all your connections are tight, not coming apart, so you don't have any leaks. And then it all comes down to just reconnecting your electrical connections, getting your radiator hose back on, getting your serpentine belt back on, your throttle body back on if you'd taken that off, and then reconnecting your batteries. And hopefully now you have a better understanding of what it takes to install and remove the CP3 high pressure fuel injection pump on this 6.7 liter Dodge Cummins.